Welcome to The Game. This is the show where we go play by play analyzing the game of politics. Today, we're going to zero in on the topic of Latin America, how the United States is redefining its role in the Western Hemisphere. We're going to look at this at theory, but we're also going to look and zoom in to real examples, Venezuela, Cuba, but also news coming out of the State Department and out of Congress related to Belize. This small country is now on the radar of Washington. What does this mean? And here today to talk about all these topics, joining me is Jose Maella. He is the managing partner at Forward Global Miami. He is a former White House and State Department official. Jose, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Wadi. It's great to be here. Love the game. Can't wait to get into this episode with you.
Yeah, it's such an interesting time. We're coming off of the heels of what we saw here in El Doral, in South Florida, in Miami, the Shield of the Americas, this historic reunion with approximately 12 countries, the presidents of these countries, their head of states, coming to the United States, meeting with Donald Trump. For those who missed this, tell me, what was this meeting, but also the significance of it?
Yeah, look, this was a meeting that was planned for a bit, and I give the president and Secretary Rubio a tremendous amount of credit for having the conviction and the vision to do this, right? This is something that I think needed to happen, which was a gathering of presidents who have all aligned themselves as allies of the United States in the fight against the narco-terrorism that we see in the region, in the fight for due process and rule of law in the region, and also as a result of that, in a unified force to bring more investment so that you could create more jobs and more opportunity in the region, which then helps to solve a lot of the crises and a lot of the problems that we have. So I think, again, kudos to them in the middle of also a major military action in Iran, as we've seen. They did not let that deter their conviction, their decision to do this. And all these presidents that came, I think, have a different understanding of what that special relationship is like with the United States.
I think the rules to the game have changed in the sense that Donald Trump, especially in this second term, is looking at the Western Hemisphere in a very different way. You mentioned Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who used to be on the Senate Foreign Affairs. The topic of the Western Hemisphere and foreign policy in general for Marco Rubio is not new. Now, the question is, these rules have changed in which way? So before the United States, we talk about the Monroe Doctrine historically. In your opinion, did previous presidents in the last few decades, has the United States taken the gas off the pedal in relation to the Monroe Doctrine? And what do you think is the philosophy of Donald Trump now towards the Western Hemisphere?
Yeah, look, I think the Monroe Doctrine was something that we all learned about in our school books, right? And we thought it was fascinating how President Monroe made this decision to say, hey, this is our hemisphere. We're going to play a bigger role and deter. And this is, a couple hundred years ago, right? Or 80 some odd years ago. Anyway, so it clarified to the world what our point of view was around our hemisphere back then. Now, it's not something that necessarily other presidents were using after that. There were different moments in history where there was action by the U.S. in order to try to either preserve democracy or fight against dictatorships or drug trafficking or all these other things that have happened. But I think what you saw with the new national security strategy, which is where people say that this Monroe Doctrine corollary, and of course it's kind of funny to call it the Donroe Doctrine. I think even the president might like that, right? Because he's now putting his name on it. But what this did was that it clarified it. And so it's not like we're going back and taking an old historical declaration by a president, but we're saying, look, there's precedent here. There was a reason why that was done. And now it's a little bit different in the world that we're in today, right? It's about understanding who our allies are in the region, but also understanding our adversaries. And our adversaries could be global adversaries, like Iran, for example, who are trying to do things that undermine U.S. national interest. We have a similar dynamic, for example, with some of the Chinese investments that have taken place that are concerning to the United States. And we saw that from day one. So I'd say this is something that needed to happen, and that President Trump, in a way, was signaling from the first day that he got elected, from the first moment that he started to make declarations about Latin America when he was still working out of Mar-a-Lago during the transition. You started to see this, right? And people laughed about certain things like the Gulf of the Gulf of America, and wanted to impose that narrative to make. I think as much. It's not so much to remove the name of Mexico, because I know it had a traditional name of the Gulf of Mexico, but it was more to make a clear point that we are going to protect our backyard.
Yep.
We're going to take this seriously. We're going to take the Caribbean, the Central America, the sort of northern states of South America seriously. And then as you go even further, we're going to take this this initiative of the Americas all the way from Patagonia all the way to Alaska, and try to build a sustainable, its own ecosystem, both economic and security-wise, in order to preserve what we strongly believe is the greatest hope for the hemisphere and for the United States, which is building these relationships is what's going to get us to succeed in the next century.
Well, if that's the perspective of the United States going in as a former White House staffer, someone who was at State Department, and now you just have a pulse on Latin America. You were at this event of the Shield
Yes.
of Americas. Let's pull the curtain back. Give us behind the scenes. What do you think are the kind of the takeaways? What did these countries coming in? So you gave me right now the U.S. philosophy going in. What is the mindset of many of these heads of states coming to this meeting? And what was the takeaway for not just the U.S., but also Latin America?
Yeah, so my role here was a technical one. I was there as part of the team that was producing the event, which is something I've done for years. When you're in politics, you love doing advanced work and you love doing big events. And I'm lucky to have some amazing friends who are like the principal vendor production company for a lot of President Trump's major events, for his campaign rallies, and also now for the State Department. And I was really impressed by the incredible production that was put together as part of this team that I was a part of. But these folks really, created, and I think that was intentional. President Trump is incredible when it comes to optics and messaging through visuals, and the State Department understanding global diplomacy and those kinds of things is very well aligned with that strategy of the president. So what was built was a really impressive set. Right, it was really phenomenal. Multiple rooms for different functions, multiple spaces. So that was sort of my perspective. But fortunately, obviously having a passion for these issues, but also working in them through the consulting work that I do, it was really interesting to see the interactions between the presidents that came and the U.S. And I will tell you, in that one weekend, or in that one day, let's not say a weekend, it was one day, we probably did more in that one day, and say a 6-hour stretch, more engagement, more interaction, more policy conversations, more, just relationship building than some administrations might do in 4 years.
Wow.
And I think that should put things in perspective for a lot of people, right? That, you might be able to go back and add up, and that's not just to pick on them, but they were the last administration, the Biden administration, and look at every meeting that took place with cabinet members and so on and those kinds of things. And I'm probably going to say that this day might have equated either close to that or maybe even surpassed it. So that gives you a sense of the level of emphasis that this administration is putting on these partners. Now, what was the outcome of this? There was a signing of a Doral Charter, which the president signed, and all the presidents signed. And that charter is a steadfast commitment. It's almost, I don't want to go as far as calling it a NATO alliance, but it's almost like a NATO alliance in that there's a shared interest in eradicating criminal organizations, eradicating cartels. But in order to do that, you're also committing to doing the right thing for your people, doing the right thing for protecting of property rights, protecting of rule of law, making investments in those capabilities, making investment in security, just like we asked for NATO partners to do, making investment in law enforcement, rooting out corruption. Those are real commitments. And what we see in that leadership that President Trump is taking, and we're from these countries, right? Like Honduras was one of the countries.
Yeah, they were present.
The new president, Esfura, was there, who was phenomenal. He's such a nice man, very polite, says hi to everyone.
Yeah.
He's like a local guy, and I'm really happy for Honduras that he's their leader.
Really big.
But you can tell that they are taking this very seriously, and they're going back to countries like Honduras who have had a complicated history with whether it's some of these bad actors, narco type organizations, or even just political corruption that existed because of more collectivist type authoritarian governments that were there. You know, what people might call as a you know, socialist or whatever. And so all of that factors into the breakdown of society, which then leads to these organizations coming in. So I think something that people need to take note is, if you're an ally of the United States and you're a member of this this bloc that now exists, you are going to benefit greatly. You're not only going to get some security protection, some shared assets, some intelligence sharing, some shared technical training, some shared resources that we will share, but you're also going to get investment. You're going to give confidence to the market. You're going to send signals to what they call the street, right? The
business community,
to the business community, to investment groups, and they're going to come now and say, hey, listen, these guys are part of this, you know, Shield of the Americas, the Route Charter, partnership with the U.S. Let's go look at it, because they've committed to these things, and now the U.S. is willing to back these efforts. That's a big deal. So immediately, for example, Argentina flew to New York, and they had Argentina Week, right? We've had an opportunity to work with President Milei's team for a bit now, and I've been down there and met with them, and they're incredible. But, you know, we can't discount what that's going to do in the long term. Already, President Milei was doing a lot of stuff on his own with some support from the U.S. Now that he's a part of this bloc, it puts kerosene on the fire.
Yeah, very much so. You know, one thing that really stands out to me is the countries that weren't there.
Yeah.
Right. So there were 12 countries there, but then there were several nations who, even probably if we would extend an invite, would have not come, which brings me really to the other topic, which is breaking news coming out of Washington, D.C. For those who saw many of the reports coming out, there was a letter sent from Chairman Mast of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the House, a strong letter in relation to Belize. Belize, a small country in Central America, is now on the radar. This is not the first time this letter that we're hearing about this. There was also a Floridian Press article laying out the different barriers that the government of Belize has been setting up, not just when we talk about telecommunication, ports, but in general to the community locally in Belize, or investors that are trying to make a move there. So, Jose, I do want to come in. Belize was one of the countries that was not at the Shield of Americas. It's also, like I just mentioned, on the radar of the House Committee Chairman, a letter that just went to Secretary of State Marco Rubio. A small country, but why is it drawing so much attention now?
That's a great question. And look, Chairman Mast, to his credit, is first of all fully aligned with President Trump and his policy agenda. But he is a real student of geopolitics, of security, himself having a military background, but now as a member of Congress, he has grown tremendously in his years in Congress, which were going on now 10 years. And I was lucky enough to work on his campaigns early on and help him when not a lot of folks wanted to help him. And you saw this incredible raw potential of him as a leader. And now that you see him doing these things, it's really amazing. But he's taking this seriously because there are serious national security implications. One of those implications is related to a cruise port terminal called State Bank Island. I actually work with the family that was the original owner of that cruise port, the Feinstein family, who was building a facility with the best interests of the peoples of Belize at heart, to bring tourism, to bring jobs. They were also creating jobs during the construction, and the people who were working there were from the poorest and the hardest, toughest areas of Belize City. And so this was an incredible project. They have a history of doing tourism projects that have benefited the community before. And so all of a sudden, partnership with a bank, Atlantic Bank, which is originally a Honduras-based bank, but has a big presence in Central America and in Belize, falling out. They reach a moment where there's a receivership executed, which they disagree with. But then there's an extra portion of land that the government of Belize acquires through compulsory acquisition, which is considered an expropriation. Now, when you do that, you're supposed to pay people for that. That has never happened, right? There's been no payment. It's like when governments build roads and they have to do eminent domain, you got to compensate the folks whose houses you've destroyed. So that's one component. But the other component is that it seemed, and this is what Chairman Mast reacted to, based on information that was gathered, that there was some collusion going on, that there was some inappropriate activity, for example, even in the judicial process and in the legal representation that was taking place, and that there were players involved who have strong political capital because they're either currently serving in office, formerly served at really high levels of office, who are deeply involved with this. Plus, You add to that the fact that there's a historical narrative around, for example, some of these individuals and in particular other entities that the bank has owned that were involved in a major fraud, $100 million frauds of Americans that was discovered, I believe, in 2019 called Sanctuary Belize, which they have been fined for, and they're paying back restitution, which could someday and potentially turn into some sort of deeper Department of Justice investigation. That's actually something that might be going on at the moment, and I know that Justice won't confirm those things, but it's a natural transition to go from there to that. But then there's other projects. There's another land project, Serene, Belize, where some Americans were invested in it, and the similar orchestrated set of events happened. When you're the United States government and you see these things happen, either because Americans are involved directly in being defrauded, or because the actions, these activities lead to the threatening a national security, potentially national security asset like a port, the government's going to react. So Chairman Mast, being very prudent, it has the possibility of potentially filing a bill, which is something that is still on the table, but decided that he was going to do the more direct thing and asked Secretary Rubio to look into it. And I hope that the State Department provides a thorough report, and I think they will. We've also met with the State Department. And the government, at least to their credit, has said that they're willing to cooperate. They put out a statement that acknowledged what was happening, but also acknowledged that they're committed to bringing investment into the country and growing their economy, and which is all, I think that's positive. So I hope that these kinds of issues, for example, can get resolved in an amicable way.
But what would that look like? Because a couple things come to mind. So there is already the involvement of U.S. officials. They're looking into the matter and taking steps and actions. And it sounds like this letter might have just been a first step, and it's almost like a step of almost diplomacy of showing, hey, we could take more significant actions. I think legislation being filed would really put things in motion. It would also send signals to the Justice Department, as you mentioned. It seems like this could really scale, but it sounds like this letter is a way of saying, hey, there's diplomatic routes about this. So what should be the reaction? How do we solve some of these issues?
Yeah, I think this letter is very serious. If you notice, they don't send a lot of these letters out. So I think it's a good way of
and I may add to Senator or
the
Secretary Rubio, who we know has a keen eye for Latin America.
Absolutely. And there are other folks who know the details of this in the U.S. government. They're very well versed in these kinds of issues because they're tracking criminal activity throughout the region, right? What happens when you have this kind of breakdown in rule of law is you allow for these, narco terrorist organizations to step in, and whether it's in a free trade zone, they've had some issues in a free trade zone there with like illegal cigarettes and things like that, or other things that could happen. So that's why the U.S. is concerned, because they can't afford for countries that are small like that to then become havens for bad breakdown in society, breakdown in rule of law, which then leads to these actors stepping in. And you already have some elements and traces of that. And so I think the best course of action is for them to realize that this is serious and to take action and to settle this matter. Now, what could happen later is exactly right. It was very responsible of Chairman Mast to do this. It was the right first step. Legislation could be filed, right? There's other action that could be taken by other agencies. Like I mentioned, the fact that there's a thread that connects some of these cases with some of the same players raises a red flag at the Department of Justice. That creates a whole nother set of issues if, this becomes a serious criminal investigation. And then there's organizations like the U.S. Treasury Department, which is also monitoring bad financial actors with bad history and could lead to sanctions, right? OFAC sanctions, which would be devastating, because then you're talking about not just the economy of Belize, but now other countries in Central America, potentially even Honduras, where the bank is headquartered and has assets. So these are all issues that could quickly spiral out of control. And I think this is where the seriousness of the Trump administration and this government is very real, right? They're not lighthearted about these kinds of issues. They're going to take them very seriously. And I think folks who are on the other side of this need to realize that things have changed and that you need to be responsive and you need to be responsible when dealing with these kinds of matters.
Yeah, and I think this also, everything you just mentioned sends a signal to the investment and entrepreneurial business community here in the United States in relation to any kind of future business they're going to want to do in that region. Jose, I want to ask you if you could put yourself in the shoes of someone from Belize who maybe reports, I have seen that the media has picked up this letter, and they're, seeing what's going on, and they might want to say, hey, how is this going to impact me? Again, putting yourself in their shoes of someone in Belize, why should they care about this topic and about what their government is doing?
Yeah, look, first and foremost, Belize is a beautiful country with incredible people and amazing opportunity, just its natural beauty, right? And there's been tourism there, which isn't fully realized. Like, you could have a lot more tourism, and that tourism fuels their economy. So if you can get more confidence, more tourism, this asset, for example, can actually be built, then you could actually create more jobs and create more opportunity. The scenarios here are very straightforward. There's, being on the wrong side of the United States in a moment where they're paying incredible attention to the region and dealing with things in a very direct manner, which could create downstream negative impacts, or having leaders that say, hey, we need to solve this. We need to get the parties to the table. Let's settle this matter. And by the way, then that leads to confidence. And that confidence then leads to investment. And it leads to, a different kind of relationship. I mean, hopefully someday they're at the table at the next Shield of the Americas event, right? That's a real possibility, but there's steps that they need to take to align with the U.S. in some of these strategies. And I don't want to say that the folks who were there, it's not a you're with us or you're against us kind of thing, but you definitely want to be with the U.S. You definitely want to be part of that framework instead of on the outside looking in and just sitting there allowing things to happen in your country that put you in a negative light. So I think that the future could be very bright, and it should be bright because they deserve that. But it's a matter of what the leadership is ready to do, and what some of these other private players are willing to do in order to settle these kinds of issues.
Yeah, this is a topic we're going to continue to follow here on The Game because it is evolving. Before closing out, I kind of want to throw some quick questions at you, get some quick response. Again, with the topic of Latin America, I want to go through a couple of countries: Venezuela, Cuba, Honduras, and El Salvador. And I'm going to ask you on each one, what's your prediction by the end of the year? Where do you see these countries, and what's the biggest opportunity now? Let's start with Venezuela. Again, where do you see them by the end of 2026, and what's the biggest opportunity?
Look, I think Venezuela, Secretary Rubio laid out 3 stages. There was a stabilization, a growth, and a transition. I feel like we're already moving, and this is my point of view, from stabilization to growth, right? That's happening based on cabinet members going down there, recognition of the government, and the current acting president aligning with U.S. interests and being a good partner in that sense. However, there needs to be a transition at some point. Everyone is clear-eyed about that, and that transition needs to happen when the conditions are right. In order for that to happen, you need to have open press. These individuals who have been exiled, right? Some of these future political leaders aren't even in the country. They need to be allowed to go back under the right conditions, right? At the right time. So you also can't rush that, because that could actually put their lives in danger or create other problems at the moment. But that will come. And when that happens, I think you'll have an election. By the end of the year, maybe you're still in this growth stage and probably getting much closer to that announcement of when that transition could occur. Hopefully that's where we're at as we reach the end of the year. And maybe that's something that starts to unfold in 2027. But people sometimes are like, wow, a year, 2 years, that's actually quite fast.
Yeah.
It's taken governments that have changed 3, 5, even 10 years before when you go from dictatorship, socialism to democracy.
Yeah, and I would think Cuba's different because Cuba doesn't have that opposition the way Venezuela does. It's been there for a lot longer. So where do you see Cuba?
Cuba's very different. Now, Venezuela has remnants of an economy from 25, 30 years ago that Cuba doesn't have. Cuba's economy is gone. Now, that doesn't mean there isn't any economy. There are things that the state built that work, quote unquote, right, that function. There are some folks in there that have ability to do technical work within government, but it's very different than Venezuela. So in Cuba's case, listen, I would love nothing more than for all of us who've grown up in Miami, my father being Cuban, to have a quote unquote free Cuba. But I think it's it's different because there's that foundation isn't there, so you really are starting at zero. I have faith in Secretary Rubio. He understands this issue better than anyone, and I think everyone needs to be patient with him and give him and the president the room that they need to make these decisions. But we trust that they're going to make the right one, and they both understand what this means. They don't mince words around freedom. They understand where freedom is, and I know that's where we're going to reach. So it's tough to know exactly what it's going to be, right? What it's going to look like, but definitely should include releasing political prisoners, releasing any Americans, for example, that are being held unjustly, and allowing for the private sector to flourish, which is what Secretary Rubio has been advocating for.
Yeah, Honduras, you mentioned earlier, new president Osfura, but also new mayor of the capital, Juan Diego, the alcalde de Tegucigalpa.
I love that guy.
What do you see as what do you see as the opportunity for Honduras? Where do you see them by the end of 2026, or let's say a little bit longer, just because they have a new government now?
Yeah, look, the future is bright for Honduras. Honduras, another great country in Central America with incredible potential. I think Honduras wants a closer relationship with the U.S. That's what we saw in the campaign, right? Even from some of the folks who didn't win, like Nasrallah and Chano Rivera and others, that were talking about building a closer relationship. So I think the general sense is we want to be a friend to the U.S. I think Honduras received really well the president's participation in the Shield of the Americas. I believe that there could be both a military and security partnership, but also an economic one, and maybe some sort of, maybe not full-blown free trade agreements, things like that, but something that allows for more investment in maquilas and in manufacturing, where you have the talent and the skill. And what I tell people all the time when they talk about immigration, I was like, listen, most people that come here that look for opportunity, they would love nothing more than to be in their home countries, especially if they just got here and they don't have status and all these things. Because people love their families.
Yeah, they love their culture, they love their home, they love their country.
That's the hardest thing to have to leave behind. So obviously the United States provides incredible opportunity for people, but if those opportunities can be provided in people's home countries, you'll have the brain drain come back.
Yes.
The talent come back and help rebuild their country. And I think we could see that in Honduras.
And that's essential. Let me ask these last two. Give me Argentina and El Salvador to close off.
Argentina is at the cusp of just really skyrocketing. And it's one of those stories that people have always said, because Argentina has everything. It's got oil. It does. It has energy. It has an abundance of electricity. It has an abundance of agriculture. It has, beautiful geography, beautiful tourism, cities, highly educated population, incredible talent, and it's just a great
soccer team.
Great soccer team. And it's just a great country. So that potential, I think it needed a new leader, and it needed to do away with decades of centralized government.
Bad policy.
And I don't even want to call it, because it's sort of like a version of, some people say, well, it's socialism. Well, I don't even know if it's socialism. It was this weird kind of state-run, somewhat corrupt government system that just taxed and took from the people, and there was this unofficial economy that needs to come out into the light. So I think President Milei understands all that. President Milei and his team are working really hard to pass laws. Thanks to President Trump's endorsement and their hard work, they were able to win the parliamentary elections in a big way. So now you've got Congress aligned, the presidency aligned, great talent, great leaders there. I feel like they are on the cusp of having an incredible year, and you're going to see big investments in minerals, in energy, and in infrastructure, in transportation, and all of that. We were down there at a meeting with the president's senior advisor, and what we talked about was we need to find a way for every Argentine to have a shovel in their hand. And if we can get there and people can go to work and rebuild their country, the future is limitless for them.
It's bright. El Salvador, what would you say? Very different than it was in the past.
I had never seen President Bukele in person, and it was cool to see him at this event. There's some air about him that he really is, he really has this, confidence and
presence.
Yeah, he has a presence, and I give him a lot of credit for that, because I think that projection has been infectious to the region, right? As much as President Trump has had an impact on some of these leaders winning, I think he has too, especially because of what he did to turn around a story of El Salvador. I don't want to call it a failed state, but it was definitely a failing state, right? With rampant corruption, crime, and it shows that you can do that. It requires difficult decisions. Sometimes, some criticism that's very, very harsh. But I think he's created a model in El Salvador now that's leading to investment, growth in technology.
Yeah.
He's leaning into data centers. He's been big on crypto and doing things that are making young people in El Salvador feel like there's hope. And that's the best part, because these are all countries that are very young. Latin American countries are very young. And this is where I think we have a huge advantage, and kind of tie it up to what we talked about in the Shield of Americas. We don't have the problems that the rest of the world is having, right? We have a shared set of values in the Western Hemisphere. We have and in the Americas, we have shared principles. We have a lot of shared history. And so if we can align these things and bring security and safety to the people, deal with those issues in Mexico and in Central America and in South America that are keeping that from happening, we could have an incredible future. And by the way, we didn't mention Mexico, but Mexico, U.S. Trade relations, they are our #1 trading partner. The trade with Mexico might be bigger than the entire region combined.
It's essential.
And that is really what we should be talking about, right? We talk a lot about the criminal dynamic and the things that are going on, and there's work being done there, but that's very charged also. But really what we need to think about is, what is the future of this relationship? So if we can align those other countries, Mexico, America's interests, and have just this incredible force created, we will dominate. The next century will be the America's century.
Yeah, the Shield of the Americas, I think, is a conversation. I don't think it's the last time we've seen that reunion, but also it's not just those 12. I think we'll continue to see a lot of things happening. Colombia is going to have elections coming up. We didn't talk about Ecuador, Chile. There's so much going on in the region. We'll definitely have you on the show. But I do want to thank you for this conversation, for joining us today. Your insight is very helpful to our audience and to the conversations that we're seeing there. Thank you again for joining us here on The Game, the podcast where we go play by play, analyzing the game of politics.